Okay, so we are now recording. So as I mentioned prior, this lecture is going to be about death, dying, and bereavement. And a reason why I like to save this to the end, not only because does it chronologically fit with what we've learned with the lifespan development in psychology, but this is the very end of everything, right? This is what we know, at least in the physical sense, to be the ultimate outcome of life, right? Is how we wrap it up and how we go through this process. And as you learned, especially with Erik Erikson's psychosocial developmental model, we kind of take our lives in stages, and we build up to the very end goal, which is how we accept our own mortality. And that plays a very important part in how we live our final days, and how we interact with our family members and loved ones, and how we bereave maybe a spouse or a partner or a loved one that passes before us. Okay, so and each, as you'll see, I'll describe this a little bit more when I get into the lecture, but as you'll see, each age group has a different outlook on life because it's their stage of life that they're in. And we'll kind of uncover that a little bit too. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you here so you can, again, death by PowerPoint. I apologize for that, but I just want to keep everything clean and concise, okay? So just to start off, like I mentioned, some people believe that we cannot really study death until after it occurs. However, there's a lot of research out there that allows us to freeze our brains and bodies. And there, in fact, is research now that is extending past the last heartbeat and the last recorded brain activity. And it's really, really cool stuff. I think I have some links in YouTube that studies that. So we can see brain activity long after the life has left the body. But for the concept of our class, we're going to really limit this to the point where our body stops functioning, and that's where we'll define what we'll define as death. But we'll also really discuss the bereavement and the process through which those that are left behind, the process that they have to go through. Okay. Did that slide change for everybody?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just making sure. All right. So we find that the experience of death, it varies from person to person. And if you've gone through experiencing the grieving process, you probably know that already. Everybody's a little bit different. And there's a point where it's a natural, normal grieving process. And then there might be something that kicks it into a little bit more of a clinical sense, like depression or anxiety or even PTSD. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But more specifically, we've been able to research the experiences as it relates to different groups of people according to their age, like I mentioned earlier. Young people, for example, they perceive death as a loss of opportunity to really experience things and the loss of family relationships sometimes, okay? We've heard even as jokes in movies or, when a teenager who says, I don't want to die a virgin, right? Or I don't want to die without having seen this or done that, then it really kind of encapsulates the idea behind that, right? And we think of that because they imagine young people tend to look at death as missing out on something. They haven't gotten to certain stages. They haven't gotten rich yet, so on and so forth. But older adults, they worry more about loss of time, to really complete their inner work. So backtracking a little bit, you have younger folks that are more worried about missing out on something, and you have older adults who worry about missing out on themselves, developing themselves, achieving, maybe looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, hitting that next stage of self-esteem or self-actualization, right? So things like that. So this really happens in middle adulthood, where they may feel fear of leaving their kids unprotected, or because they're still very young, right? Middle-aged adults are most fearful of death in all other age segments, and this is because of its proximity to it. Okay, they're getting a little bit closer to that older age, and also they're relatively young still, right? And we find that those that are most likely to fear the period of uncertainty before death than death itself are older adults. And I guess what I mean by that are they're closest to death, and therefore they really don't tend to fear it that much. They just fear the uncertainty behind it. And now we find pretty much what Erik Erikson described as the lack of ego and integrity, and the result in the greater fear of death and a sense of despair, if you remember that last stage in Erik Erikson's psychosocial development. But again, it's really not a fear of death, but it's a sense that they did not accomplish what they were supposed to. Okay. So your book makes a mention of Kubler and Ross's stages of dying. Okay. And we all go through, according to this theory, we all go through these 5 steps here. First, we tend to deny the fact that we're close to death. And then there might be a sense of anger. And we may try to bargain with some supreme being, or maybe with doctors, or even ourselves, or with others. And then following that, there might be a sense of depression after we go through the other steps. And then there's the stage of acceptance. But all throughout, there's a possibility that things are going to be a little bit back and forth with some of these, right? So for example, somebody might feel anger first. And this is probably one of the largest criticism of Kubler-Ross's stages of dying, is there really are no distinct stages here, okay? We might see a couple that blend in with each other. We might see anger with bargaining. We might see denial and depression, right? So we do tend to see more of a blend of these. It's more like a roller coaster as opposed to a step stage. So just kind of keep that in mind with that. But in essence, we do tend to see in some form these characteristics, these traits. Okay. And I'm going to touch a little bit more on that later, because at the end of this, I'm going to give you my personal view on, not personal, I guess, professional process for helping people with the grieving process. Okay. So the next theoretical concept that your book pointed out to was Sigmund Freud. And as many of you have taken previous psychology courses, either with me, we love Freud, right? He really coined a lot of great ideas. He was a wackadoodle in some areas, but for the most part, a lot of his subconscious and unconscious thought process and personality really holds true today in terms of our theories. But according to Freud's psychoanalytical theory, we will grieve naturally the death of a loved one, but the ego will protect itself from unpleasant emotions through defense mechanisms, if you remember. And they're really automatically there. We don't even realize that they're there sometimes, but they pop up automatically. And denial and repression are 2 of the most common ones that we see with the grieving process or the experience of death. But the bad thing about this is that these defense mechanisms can only work for so long before they basically break down and allow us to experience what we were supposed to experience to begin with. Okay. And that would be more along the line of the Kubler and Ross model that we saw with acceptance, right? Experiencing what we were meant to experience. Now, to avoid mental illness, individuals must examine the emotions and their source directly. And oftentimes this can be achieved through counseling or through guided counseling, or encouraging a person to cry the experience and the grief and allow them to express how they're grieving with that person to others. And that's really encouraged. In fact, it was really influenced by Sigmund Freud to do this. Oftentimes when I work in therapy, and I'll talk a little bit more at the end of this lecture about it, I would have individuals do role play. I use, and this really works with anything if somebody's dealing with any kind of grief and loss, or even a loss of a relationship, because we, as humans, we like closure. We like things to be packaged up and wrapped up and made sense of in our world. And if something doesn't make sense, we seek the answer to that. So one of the ways that I find to be most helpful is doing role play, or what I call the empty chair, is having somebody that should be sitting in that chair with them and facilitating a conversation with them so that they can relieve themselves. They can talk about what they would want to say to that person, and maybe even give them a little feedback as to what that person might say to them. And what I find is that it's a really cathartic experience of them feeling validated, feeling like they've achieved closure, and that they can kind of close the chapter of their book in their life. Most times it's successful. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer process. And again, everybody's a little bit different. But it was through that process, being able to communicate, that the person that they would have several sentiments that they would be able to get out. And sometimes those sentiments were not necessarily pleasant, especially if there was some kind of trauma behind that. Sometimes it was anger. Sometimes there were other emotions that they needed to come out, but that was healthy for the person to let that out. Okay. The next area that your book talked about was the loss of a loved one. And when somebody has been, especially in older age, when two people have been together for a very, very long time, we find that there are a lot of emotions that are wrapped up in that, a lot of financial dependency, maybe even physical dependency, right? Because if somebody has lost functionality medically, they might depend on that other person for a caretaker. So it can be especially stressful in widowhood. But we also find that there are differences when a spouse loses the other, when it comes down to gender. Okay, even today. Okay, and it really depends on the role, which I'll talk about here in a second. But widowhood has immediate and long-term effects on the immune system. We often find that sometimes the individual's health would be compromised shortly after the loss of a loved one. And that typically returns to normal roughly about a year after. And I'm throwing out timelines here, and I just really want to caution you, any of you that are working as a practitioner in the field, either nursing or counseling or therapy or whatever, these numbers tend to fluctuate. I've seen people that have gone through the grieving process in a couple months, and I've seen people take up to 10 years or more. So it really depends on the person, their attachment, and how they get through this process. So just to caution you on that. But typically, we would see a person return back to normal functioning levels at about a year. Okay. Now, the depression rises substantially initially. Okay. And this is basically the relationship. It's characterized by emotional distance and conflict, and are more likely to lead to depression than those that were warm. So something to keep in mind. If somebody had a turbulent relationship, that might be a little harder to get over, as opposed to somebody that had a close, nurturing, and mature relationship. And those relationships that were healthy, they were adequate, and they often seemed to apart their separate ways, and they seem to be okay. Okay. But those relationships that were difficult, those relationships that were not necessarily healthy, they often bring about a sense of despair. And if you remember that from Eric Erickson, right? And depression, as we feel that there's some unfinished business there, right? Women, interestingly, typically suffer more economically than emotionally, right? In responses to those losses of their husbands or loved ones, either one. But for men, for the most part, they don't experience a lot of economic loss, but they'll experience the emotional turmoil that's associated with it. Okay. When it comes down to grieving, we find that symptoms of depression that are brought about by the death of a loved one are relatively normal, but this is considered to be a pathological grief, meaning not necessarily what we would consider within norm when the symptoms last more than 2 months. If the grief symptoms last more than 6 months, then the individual is believed, according to the DSM-5, if you remember we talked about, we believe it that they suffer from long-term depression or major depressive disorder, okay, MDD, and it would no longer be considered grieving. All right. Now that's clinical speak. Okay. We might experience some form of depression long after that. But if any of you have taken my previous courses, we go by the 3Ds for diagnosing people. And that's deviation of thought and behaviors. Distress, is it causing distress for that individual or others around them? And is it dysfunctional? Is it lowering their quality of life? Are they not able to work or sustain relationships because of whatever those thoughts and behaviors are? And again, as mentioned earlier, men are more likely to suffer more than women. And the risk of death by men, typically by natural causes of suicide, are significantly greater also for men than women. Okay. There are different hypotheses behind this difference and this emotional loss. And it mostly points to men feeling lonely and not having somebody who has catered to them for so long in marriages, where there were a lot of gender stereotypes back then, right? Back then, we're kind of seeing a shift in those roles now, but those traditional gender stereotypes have perpetuated that. And if the traditional male role was catered to, then that would be a loss. That would be a significant loss for that person, right? Whereas if the men who broke those gender stereotypes, a sense of loss is really argued to believe less intense for that person. Okay. All right. So let me stop sharing my slide here. And so when dealing with death and loss as a therapist, there's really, we look at Kubler-Ross, we look at Freud, we look at Erik Erikson. We looked at a lot of theories through this course, okay? And many of you probably, if you remember, I may have stated earlier on in this course that psychology is not a hard science. And what do I mean by that? It's not 1 + 1 = 2 every time. Okay. Sometimes 1 + 1 = 3, or sometimes 1 + 1 = 0. We aren't really fact-based. We're theoretical. So it's not a hard, fast science. It's a very, very soft science. So we kind of deal more with norms and values as opposed to hard facts. So with that said, there's really no right or wrong way to deal with the loss of a loved one. Okay. You can really expect grieving to be rough, and it's different for every single person. One of I would say probably the number one issue I find with a lot of my clients that I work with is they have expectations of themselves, and some people put expectations on them. They might hear comments like, "You should be over that by now. You should do this and you should do that." And for those of you that are going to work in the field, keep that in mind, that people might be telling them that they might have these expectations, because those expectations can be very, very toxic. So allowing people to feel what they're going to feel and experience what they would normally experience is probably the best thing that they can do. Another important thing is not just to have not a matter of coping with loss, but it's about coping with change. All right. It's not necessarily the person that they lost, but it's the changes that it brings about for that individual. Could be economic, it could be loneliness, it could be companionship, right? It could be wrapped up really in just about everything. And that takes a lot of time to deal with. And how do you deal with the death of a loved one, right? How do you live your life in the face of life-changing events like these? If you've gone through that, then you could probably understand where I'm coming from when I say these, give you these points and these examples. We don't really have all the answers. And honestly, if you've gone through this, you have to go through work and get through your own pain in your own way, in your own pace. But if you're looking for some things to do and advice to give others, I do have a couple things here. If you want to write them down, great. I'm not going to worry about slides or anything for this one. But the first thing you need to remember is that grief is a process and not a task. You might have heard the popular theory that breaks up bereavement into those stages, right? Like Kubler and Ross: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And while you might identify with some or all of these steps, you got to remember that grief is less like a staircase and more like a roller coaster, as I mentioned earlier. There are peaks and dips, and they don't always happen in predictable ways. You might feel better for a while and then worse the next day, and that's okay. It's natural to have an uneven journey with whatever that grief process might look like for you or that individual. The second point is, don't be afraid of the pain. We are taught at a young age to coddle our wounds, right? To be afraid of pain and avoid it. This is something that people are going to feel, and you might feel. And you shouldn't try and stuff your sorrow away into a place where you don't have to deal with it. It's just going to stay there until you do deal with it. In order for you to work through your grief, you're first going to have to acknowledge that it exists, right? You can't really heal a wound until you start taking care of it. So you got to be able to identify it and then figure out what you got to do to fix it, and either disinfect it, whatever. But same way with your spiritual and emotional needs, making sure that you know that pain exists and then dealing with it. There are a lot of ways you can do that. Okay. You might have to be alone for a bit. Some people find it helpful to write their feelings in a journal or a diary or something, or maybe even talking to somebody. Do things that make you happy when you're grieving. It's sometimes difficult to hold on to who you are. After all, really, so much of this energy was focused on the mourning of the loved one, which is fair, but it's easy to get sucked into the mind space where you can't even remember your former self. It's really okay to take time and do things that make you feel like yourself and give you joy. So do nothing, do something. Short term, it's not a big issue. But on the far end of the spectrum, I do want to caveat: we might see somebody that does nothing for a very long time, or it might see something. One of the I have a client that comes to mind that he lost his spouse to cancer, unfortunately. And he worked really, really hard for 5 years. He was doing, no kidding, 100 to 120 hours as an orderly in a hospital. And he was just working really, really hard just to distract his mind. And he did that for about 5 years until he got injured and put on disability. And then everything hit him. And then, of course, he had that wasted time to deal with. So, there is that balance. We want to take time for ourselves and do nothing. And we do like distractors and things that we can really get excited about. But somewhere in there is where we want to exist, not one extreme or the other. Okay. The third point is recognize the relationship between the mind and the body. I've talked about mindfulness throughout my lectures. And when you're experiencing grief, it's really easy to forget the things that you usually do as a matter of routine: taking a shower, getting enough sleep, eating. Neglecting your physical health is really only going to take a greater toll on your mental health, which is taking a pretty significant hit during these periods of grief. So encourage people to make an effort to take care of themselves and take care of yourselves. I always kind of like to think that's what our loved ones or the person that we're bereaving would want us to do, right? So maybe consider that. Fourth point is, you don't have to be alone in the grief. If your feelings are too overwhelming for you to sort out, that's okay, but go to someone else for help. It could be somebody maybe a family member, a friend. It could be a therapist or a professional who knows how to help with people deal with this exact situation that you find yourself in with this. Just the act of talking out loud about your feelings can be incredibly cathartic. Finding somebody who can help you sort them and walk through them is even better. So I always look for resources when somebody is going through the grieving process. Some people respond very well to groups. Some people might need to speak more individually, and some people just might be willing to just be alone for a little bit of time. Okay. So anyway, that's kind of my spiel on how I approach death and dying and bereavement. Any questions, or does anybody have anything to add?
I do.
Go ahead.
I actually just read this article, I think that like came out a month ago, about zombie genes, where there's like parts of your brain that stay alive like up to 12 hours, like after you die.
Yeah.
And they've been like studying that. I like had never heard of it, but I thought that was pretty neat how they said that like obviously when you die, your heart stops and your brain activity stops. And even though like your brain isn't putting out like a ton of brain activity, there's these things, that they're calling zombie cells that like are active. Like it's weird.
I haven't heard them called zombie cells, but I do know that certain areas of your brain, like your hippocampus, which is responsible for your memory, stays alive for a very long time. Your amygdala shuts down pretty quickly. And I think your prefrontal cortex, most of it stays alive for a while. But there's a lot of research that we're doing now, and it sounds very sci-fi, but I think that's been a dream of scientists for a long time, is to extrapolate people's memories and experiments from a person that has deceased. So yeah, there's some really cool, groundbreaking stuff out there. It sounds like something right off the movies, and I've never heard them called zombie cells before, but that's pretty interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Well, I think they call them like zombie genes, not like so much cells, but I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, so pretty cool stuff, huh? All right, well, thank you for sharing that. All right, anybody else? Okay, I'm going to stop recording here, and